So this is the second part of the integument. Yesterday we talked about the layers. We talked about the epidermis. We talked about the dermis and the hypodermis. We talked about the cells of the epidermis, the strata in the epidermis. We talked about the layers in the dermis as well. And we mentioned some things like the Meissner's corpuscles and Pacinian corpuscles. So today we're going to continue on and we're going to continue talking about the integument. And what I want to start with is skin color. So if you look at the people of the planet, there's a huge variation in skin color. So if you look over here at this person, you can see that her skin is really, really, really dark. And then if you look here, it's a little bit lighter and a little bit lighter. And then if you look at this person, the skin is almost just white. And so there has to be some reason for this. And so we're going to talk about the reasons for having different skin color and also what produces those different tonalities. And so again, if you look at this, you can see huge variations. Well, yesterday we mentioned albinos. So this guy right here is an albino. And so if you notice, his skin really has no color, but that doesn't mean when you look at him, you don't see color. What I see when I look at him is I see pink. Now up here, obviously the hair is white, but the reason why is because there's no melanin in here, none. And remember, the problem is they have a defect in the DNA where the DNA codes for that enzyme tyrosinase. So they have no tyrosinase, so they can't make melanin. And that's true for their skin, it's true for their hair, it's also true for their eye color. And so if you look at their eye color, again, it's going to be this sort of pink color, but that's actually the color of blood. That's what we're seeing because the skin has no color of its own. Contrast that with this person over here who basically also has very, very white skin. And look at the hair. Again, it's not white, but it's certainly light in color. But this person does have the ability to make melanin. This is not an albino. And so if you look at the variation here, dark, 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 lighter, lighter, and so on, there has to be some reasons for this. We even have a scale for skin color. So if you look at this, you can probably find your own skin tone on here somewhere. If you hold your arm up next to the screen, you can kind of compare it and see what it is. Well, if you don't want to do that, you can do it for these people. So if you figure out what her skin tone is and what her skin tone is, you can see very, very big differences. This is kind of interesting, I think. If you look at this, here's a dark-skinned guy who married a light-skinned woman, and these are twins. So these are twins, but look how different their skin tones are. And if you follow those twins and look at them a little bit later on, this is what they look like. So look at this dark hair, sort of olive colored skin. And if you look over here, there's this sort of strawberry blonde hair and white skin. But they're twins, which means they share the DNA from their parents. And so let's talk about why that is. Why do we have all these different skin tones? Well, we already talked about something, which is UV light. Remember we talked about UVA and UVB. UVB, remember B, you can think of it as standing for burn, although that's not what it stands for. But remember, it's confined to the upper layers of the skin, and what it does is it damages these cells, and we get things like sunburns. UVA, though, penetrates much deeper down here where there are living cells. And the UVA, and there's collagen and all that sort of stuff in here. UVA, you can kind of think of A as stand for aging, even though it really doesn't. But anyway, it causes damage to tissues. And remember, these tissue damages, the burns and the aging, are cumulative. And as you get more and more of these burns and more of these aging, whatever, you get these cumulative damage to cells. And eventually what might happen is the cells change and become cancerous. And so it's a problem. So if we have too much UV light, we wind up with all this skin damage, and we can wind up with skin cancer, and people with skin cancer die. But there's another thing. If we go back here, this UV light, even though it causes skin damage, we also use this UV light. We use it, and we use it to produce vitamin D. And remember, we talked a little bit about vitamin D. Vitamin D is made in this three-step process, and one of the processes is made in the skin. And we cannot live without vitamin D, because without vitamin D, we can't absorb calcium. And if you can't absorb calcium, that means there's not going to be any calcium in the bones, and there's not going to be any calcium floating around in the blood for other uses. And so what you wind up with are all kinds of problems. And one of the things you wind up with is called rickets. And if you look at rickets, rickets can cause death as well. And so look, we're on this sort of a love-hate relationship. Here we are perched up here on this, and that's ideal. But if we get just a little bit too much UV light, we wind up with things like skin cancer. But if we get a little bit too little UV light, we wind up with things like rickets. And so we have to remember that UV light is damaging, but it's also necessary. And then remember, we also talked about what we can do to screen out UV light. Remember, we make melanin, and we ship the melanin close to the surface. And what it does is it creates this natural sunscreen. So if you have a lot of melanin, this natural sunscreen, that means this is not going to happen. And this is also not going to happen. And so we're going to have a less of a chance of getting skin cancer, but there's a greater chance of getting rickets. And so we're on this sort of precipice where we can have to balance between. And so too much, we're going to get skin cancer. And skin cancer is bad. Look at these are different pictures of skin cancer. And it's not just externally. Skin cancer is also internally. It's in your bones, in your lungs, in the liver, and places like that. And you die from it. But too little of it, and we're going to wind up with rickets. And here's what rickets looks like. I wish you could see all these pictures, but look at these deformed legs, bent legs, also deformed skeleton, and very, very, very thin bones. And so you can die from that as well. And so the problem is we can't screen out all of the UV light. If we did, we wouldn't get skin cancer. We could do this. We would have very little chance of getting skin cancer, but we would get rickets. And then if we screen out too little of the UV light, we're going to get skin cancer. So we can't all be dark and we can't all be light. It depends on where you live. And so if you think about where your ancestors came from, they came from different parts of this planet. And if you look at the planet, we're going to see that there's different amounts of UV light. Remember, this UV light hits the skin, but if it's dark, it's going to bounce off. And so there's going to be less chance to make vitamin D. So if you look at skin cancer and skin color, and if you look at rickets and skin color, this is what it looks like. So if you're this person, look, you have a very low chance of getting rickets, but you have a very high chance of getting skin cancer. But if you're this person over here, you have a very low chance of getting skin cancer, but you have a very high chance of getting rickets. And so, like I said, it depends on where your ancestors came from. So Priscilla says kids that have types of legs like that, they have a little amount of UV light. Well, they technically have a little amount of vitamin D. But remember, we're using that vitamin D, or we're using, that UV light to make the vitamin D. So let's talk about UV light. So UV light comes off the sun. Here's the sun over here. And then it shines to the earth. Well, depending on where you are on the earth, it either hits it directly and so goes all the way to the surface, or it hits it at an angle and a lot of it bounces off. So if you're in these regions right here, there's a lot of UV light. So there's a whole lot of UV light in here. And so think about it. We have a ton of UV light. The chances, what's going to happen here is you're going to get skin cancer. So remember, the people who get skin cancer are going to die. But if you think about what happens up here and maybe down here, where it's bouncing off, we're going to have chances of getting rickets. And so it depends, again, on where the UV light, where your ancestors came from. So if your ancestors came from anywhere in this belt right here, they're going to tend to have dark skin, because the chances of them getting rickets are very low, but the chances of them getting skin cancer are very high. And then if your ancestors came from anywhere in these areas, you're going to be much lighter in color. And so if you look at skin color map, it looks just like this. So humans we developed right here. This is where humans started. And so think about it. If you think about that being the place that the first humans came from, what color do you think the first human skin was? What color were there? Anybody want to guess? They were very, very, very dark. Maybe even so dark you could say that they were black. They were very dark, which was great, because right here is where there are tons of this UV light. And so if you're very dark, you're not going to have a chance of getting skin cancer. There's no problem with rickets here because there's so much UV light. But then something happened. What happened is these people started moving. As we got more and more and more humans, they started moving. And look what happens when they move out of their area. So now if you look right here, there's not quite as much UV light. There's less UV light. So if you're very, very, very dark, what happens is when you're a child and you're that dark, you might wind up getting rickets and you die, which means that you're not going to leave any offspring. But if you're just a little bit lighter in color, not dark, 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 but just sort of brown, then that means you're still not going to get skin cancer and you're not going to get rickets. And so you're going to live and you're going to have babies. And the babies are going to be basically the same color that you are. So over time, all of the people in this area wound up with a little bit lighter skin. Same thing down here, a little bit lighter skin. But people kept multiplying and people kept moving. And look what happens when they moved up here. Now there's even less UV light. And so even the dark brown people started getting rickets. And they didn't grow up and they didn't have babies. The ones who did grow up were not brown, they were tan colored. And they're the ones that left babies. So over time, everyone wound up with basically this skin color. But then it didn't stop. People kept moving, and they moved out of Africa and into Europe. And as they move, the same thing happens over and over and over again. The further north you go, or the further south you go, there's less and less UV light. And so people went from being tan to cream colored, and then from cream colored to white as they moved. Now it took hundreds of years for this to happen, but that's exactly what happened. And so we take this skin color map and we compare it to the UV light map. Look, they're exactly the same. So Here's the UV light right here where it's so bright, and that's where the darkest skins are. And move up a little bit, there's less UV light, lighter in color, less UV light, lighter in color, and so on. Does it make sense to everyone? So skin color is really just a function of this UV light. Any questions about it? Okay, that's melanin though. Melanin is not the only thing that contributes to skin color. Another thing that contributes to skin color is something called keratin. Well, look at the first 5 letters of this. What does that sound like? Sounds like carrot. And think about what color carrots are. They're sort of yellow-orange. And they're yellow-orange is because they have pigments in them. And the pigment is called keratin. Well, humans don't make keratin, but when we eat a carrot, we absorb the keratin, and what happens is we deposit it into our skin. It gets deposited into the stratum corneum. Remember, that's the outermost layer where all those dead cells are. And remember, we have thick and thin skin. And if we look at the difference between thick and thin skin, one difference is that the thick skin has a much, much thicker stratum corneum. And so thicker stratum corneum, keratin in it, what's going to happen is you're going to see it. And the place where the stratum corneum is the thickest is in the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. So if you eat a whole lot of carrots, this is what happens to you. The palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, they turn orange. And so one of the things that people feed babies is a lot of carrots. And so when the babies are fed a lot of carrots, this happens. And so you begin to turn orange. Now, I don't know if that's why Oompa Loompas are orange, or certainly about this guy, I don't know if that's why he's orange, but if you eat a lot of carrots, you can turn orange. There's one more thing that contributes to skin color, and that's just blood. So if you think about someone blushing, that blood rushes to the skin and their face, and they turn red or they turn pink. So we see the blood in the skin. Well, it's not specifically blood that is the red color. It's something called hemoglobin. That's what makes blood red. And so it gives this pinkish hue to the skin. And so anytime that blood rushes to the skin, you see this pink color. So when people get hot, especially if they're light-skinned to begin with, if they get hot, blood rushes there to cool you off and your face turns red. If you're embarrassed or something like that, you might blush. And then if you go back to that picture where we saw the albino, remember the albino has no melanin, but that doesn't mean their skin has no color. Their skin looks pink. And what we're seeing then is the color of hemoglobin. Same thing's true for an albino's eyes. Their eyes are red. They have red eyes, not green, not blue, not brown. They have red eyes because what we see is this pink color of hemoglobin. There are other things that can change the color of the skin. So you can put creams on your skin that change the color. Certainly makeup changes the color and so on. Well, makeup, though, is not permanent. But think about a tattoo. A tattoo is ink that's put into the skin, and it is permanent. There's another thing, though, that is pretty common, and that is some people take a substance called colloidal silver. It's basically just silver nitrate. And silver nitrate is actually used in medicine. Silver nitrate is put in the eyes of newborns because silver nitrate is antibacterial. It kills bacteria. It's also antiviral. It kills viruses. And it's antifungal. And so for a cream or a drop or something, it works really, really well. But some people have taken it a little further than that. And what they do is they drink it. And so they drink a little bit at a time every day, just a tiny bit. But what happens is that colloidal silver actually gets deposited into their skin. And I wish you could see these pictures, but this guy did that for years and years and years. And look, there he is. There he is right there. Now, if you're using PowerPoint, you'll be able to flick through these and you'll see his pictures. But he's basically blue. In fact, his nickname is Papa Smurf. He's dead now, but he didn't die from this. But anyway, it changed the color of his skin. And just like tattoos, it's permanent because it's almost like putting an ink into the skin. Okay, any questions about skin color? Okay, well, we've talked about the layers of the skin. Remember, we have the dermis, and we have the hypodermis, and we have the epidermis. Well, the epidermis, remember, is epithelial tissue. It's on the surface, but it also can produce things. This epidermis can produce what are called epidermal derivatives. And so that means they're derived or come from epidermal tissue. And there are things like glands and things like hairs, and hair follicles, also fingernails and toenails. And so let's talk about some of these epidermal derivatives. So let's look at glands. Now, depending on which PowerPoint you're using, it may be incorporated, but if you did it previously to today, it might be a separate PowerPoint. Well, let's look at glands. So here's the epidermis right here. It's on the surface. But look, when we get here, this epidermis folds in like this. And what it does is it builds specialized tissue or specialized cells that secrete products. It's still epidermal tissue. Look, there's our basement membrane. Here's our apical surface. Here's our basement membrane. Here's our apical surface. But they're not typical cells. They're specialized cells. And so what we get is called a gland. And so a gland is a secreting tiny little organ, basically. Well, when you look at it, it has two parts. This part down here actually produces the product, and that's called the secretory unit. But this part right here is just a pipe. That's all it is a pipe. So it can get to the outside, and that's called a duct. So if you look at a typical gland, it looks like this. And look, this gland is making this product, whatever this little product is right here. And I don't know what it is, but the product comes out of the little tube and it goes to the outside. So that's what a gland looks like. Here's another picture of the gland. It doesn't show everything else, but we can still see that this tissue right here is the same as this tissue up here. So that's the duct. But look, these cells don't look anything like that. And that's the secretory unit. And so sometimes it's called by a special name because it's producing a gland. It's called glandular epithelium. So let's look at glands. Well, in order to talk about them a little more easily, we classify them. And one way to classify them is to see where the product goes. If the product exits, in other words, it goes to the outside, it's called an exocrine gland. Crine means to secrete, and exo means exit, to the outside. So these secrete to the outside. And they do it through these little pipes, these little ducts, and it goes on to some sort of body surface. It could go to the skin, but it can also go into like your mouth or into the stomach or into the vagina or places like that. The products that come from exocrine glands are many, many different products, but the only ones we're going to talk about today are sweat and oil. It could also be, though, mucus. It could be digestive systems. It could be saliva. It could be all sorts of things. So, exocrine glands. So if we look at these exocrine glands, look, here's the secretory product right here. There's our duct. And look, it goes to the outside. Now, you may think this is in your body, but it's not. Because look, this is open. It's a tube that goes all the way through the body, and it's open on both sides. It's open on the mouth on one end, and it's open on the anus on the other end. And so this is outside, this is external, but this is also outside. This is external. So when you swallow food, it doesn't really go into your body until you break it down and absorb it. As long as it's in this tube, it's actually external. Think about swallowing a marble. What if you were to swallow a marble? What do you think would happen to it? Anybody want to guess? It's going to come right out the other end. And so it never really and truly was inside your body. So, look, all of these glands are opening to the outside. Lungs open into this tube, stomach glands, pancreas, they open into this tube, the kidney, reproductive system, all opens into this tube, nostrils, mouth, they're all external. Another way to classify glands is to look and see how many cells compose the gland, the number of cells. And there are only two choices. The two choices are one or more than one. So we have some glands that are one cell. They're called unicellular. Now humans only have one type of these, and we've already talked about it. It's the goblet cell. So remember, goblet cell is found with columnar tissue. Here's the columnar cells. But then here's a goblet cell. And remember, goblet cells make mucus. And so the mucus comes out. Here's what a picture looks like, but here's an actual photograph. And see these little bubble-like things? Those are vesicles containing mucus. They're made down here, and then they go all the way to the surface, and then the mucus is released to the outside. So again, these are exocrine glands. That's the only one we have like this. All of our other glands are multicellular. Multi, more than one cell. And so when you look at multicellular glands, we already talked about them. They have a duct and they have a secretory unit. And so we can further classify these. We can classify them on the shape, and here are the shapes. So look, these are the secretory units, not ducts, but the secretory units. And so we have three shapes. Look at this one. It should remind you of a test tube, like in chemistry. That's what it looks like. And so it's called tubular. If you look at this one, it should remind you of a flask. So if you think about a flask, it's round like this. And that's called acinar or alveolar. But this third one over here, this is not a duct. This is the tube. And this is not just a secretory unit. This is that round thing that looks like a flask. And so look, it's part tube and part flask. So tubuloacinar, that's what it's called, or tubuloalveolar. So we can classify them into these three groups: tubular, acinar, and tubuloacinar. Everybody think they can pick these out? Let's see if you can. So here's some real glands. Let's skip this for a second. Here's some real glands. So look, here's the gland right here. Now that's the duct. There's the duct. Don't look at that. But this part, there's the gland. Here's the gland. This one you can't see it very well because of the way it's cut, but it looks like that too. But remember, this is the duct. Don't look at the duct. Let's don't worry about the duct. You only look at the secretory part. So, what gland do you think this is? It's acinar. That's right. It's an acinar gland. Let's look at another one. Look at this one. Here's the duct right here, but all of this is the secretory part. It's tubular, exactly. And you can see several of them here. Here's one, and here's one, and here's one. They're all tubular. And so that leaves this one. So here's the duct right here. We're not going to look at that part, but we are going to look at this, and we're going to look at this. So what do you think this one is? Tubuloacinar, exactly. Make sense to everyone? So if we go back to these other ones here, these are some drawings, and you can see there's tubular, and tubular can be just a single or it can be more than one. There's acinar, it can be just a single or more than one. And here's tubuloacinar here. Any questions? Okay, that's one way to classify exocrine glands, and that's an anatomical way. So tubuloalveolar and tubuloacinar are the same. Acinar and alveolar are the same. Those are just two words for the same thing. Okay, that was an anatomical way of classifying them. Look, we looked at the shape here, the structure. Remember, anatomy is all about structure. But we also remember this class is also physiology. And so we can also classify them based on how they work. In other words, how do they secrete? How do they release their product? And when we do that, they're going to get three again. And these three are Holocrine, Apocrine, and Merocrine. So again, crine means to secrete. Hollow means whole. Not like a hole in the ground, but the entire amount. Crine means secrete. Apo means top or apex. And crine means to secrete. And mero means with sort of without, basically, is kind of what it means. So let's look at these. So let's look at Holocrine first. So what happens with a holocrine? Look, these are the cells down here, and here's the product right here. Well, what happens is the product builds up inside the cell. It keeps building up, building up, building up, building up. It's like putting water in a water balloon, and you keep putting more water and more water and more water. And eventually what happens is it's going to pop. It's going to rupture. And that's exactly what happens to the cells. They rupture. So look, this cell popped. This cell popped. And what happens when it pops is the cell is shed. And so not only does the product come out, but so does this entire disintegrating cell. It comes out. That's what we wind up in the secretion. So if you look at it under a microscope, not only do you see the product, but you see all of these big cell pieces because the cell ruptured, it popped. Well, look, we destroyed the cell. So unless you just want to secrete this a few times and then never do it again, we're going to have to make new cells. And the way we make new cells is by mitosis. And so if you look down here, there's cells that are going through mitosis, and we're creating new cells. And then those new cells are going to build the product, build up, build up, build up until the cell ruptures. And then we're going to make more new cells. And so when we look at this, if you look down at the bottom, these are going to be smaller cells. And what we're going to see is mitosis going on. And then if you look close to the top, we're going to see bigger cells until finally they pop and rupture. So when you look at it, it looks like this. So that's one way for the product to be secreted. And it looks sort of like this down here. So look, there's the product building up in the cell, lots and lots and lots of it, until finally the cell explodes. And the product plus all of the cell parts are going to come out with it. And this cell, obviously, is going to die, and we're going to have to make new cells to replace it. Another way that glands can secrete is this. It's called apocrine. Apo comes from the word apex, and apex means top. So look what happens. Here's the cell right here. And the product doesn't build up in the bottom, it only builds up in the top. And then what's going to happen is the top is going to pinch off. And when the top pinches off, that's what's going to be secreted. And then the cell is going to regrow the top. And again, the top is going to pinch off, and then it's going to regrow the top, and then the top's going to pinch off. So only a little portion of the cell comes out with the product. So when we look at it, it looks like this. And so what we're going to see when we look in here is we're going to see short cells because the top is already pinched off. And we're going to see tall cells where the product is building up and it's about to be pinched off. Any questions about apocrine? So if we look at it here, there's our cell, and look, the product's building up here in the top, and here it's being pinched, and finally that part is secreted. And we're going to have a short cell when that happens. And when we have this short cell, it's going to regrow. And then eventually it's going to look like that again. And then that's going to happen. And then it's going to do it over and over. So we don't have to make more new cells. We just have to regrow the top part of the cell. And then there's a third way in which glands secrete, and this is called merocrine. Remember, mero means without or no or something like that. And so there's without damage. So what happens here is the cell has the product, but the product just sort of oozes out. It goes out by exocytosis. And so there's no damage to the cells. They stay intact. So if we look at what comes out of here, there are no cell parts. There are no cell parts. There's no destroyed cells. There's no cells that have pinched off tops. There's no parts. It's just whatever the product is. So look, the cells are all the same height. There's no mitosis going on because we don't have to make new cells. There's no regrowing going on. The product just sort of oozes out. It goes out by exocytosis. And hopefully you remember that from general biology. And so if we look at it here, it looks like this. So look, cells are the same height. But what we see are these little vesicles, and the vesicles merge with the membrane and release the product. So it's exocytosis. So if we look at these three, they're very different. Holocrine, the cells explode. So they die. So we have to replace them. Apocrine, the tops pinch off. So we have to regrow the top. And Merocrine is by exocytosis, so there's no damage to the cells. The cells remain intact. Does it make sense to everyone? Any questions about it? So let's see if you can figure out cells that are doing this. Are they working by Holocrine? Are they working by Apocrine? Are they working by Merocrine? So let's look at one. So first let's just look at this. So here's a diagram. So what do you think is happening in A? Is it Holocrine? Is it Apocrine or Merocrine? And what is happening in B? So what is A? Anybody want to guess? It's Merocrine. That's exactly right. Look, the cells are all the same height. Their tops are not pinching off. There's no mitosis going on. There's no damage. It's just by exocytosis. What about B? So most people are saying apocrine, but it's not apocrine. Look what's going on down here. We're replacing cells. And look, we have tall cells across the board, but what's happening is they're rupturing. This is Holocrine. Look at some slides for real. So let's look at this. So here's the gland right here. All of these are parts of this gland. If I blow it up, it looks like this. Anybody want to guess what it is? Is it Holocrine? Is it Apocrine? Or is it Merocrine? Remember, this is the gland right here. And the product's going this way. Same thing down here and here. Apocrine. Ooh, that's exactly right, Priscilla. That's exactly right. And look, there's an easy way to tell. And the way to tell is that we have tall cells and short cells. Tall cell, short cell. Tall cell, short cell. Over here, same thing. Tall cell, short cell. Because the tops are building up, and then they pinch off. Look, this is already pinched off, but this is getting ready to pinch off. If you get to the low magnification, you can even see it in here very easily. Look, tall cells, short cell, tall cells, short cell, tall cell. Does that make sense to everyone? What about this one? What do you think this is? So here's the gland right here. The secretion's going this way. What do you think this one is? Anybody want to guess? It's Merocrine, exactly. Look, all the cells are the same size. There's no mitosis going on in there. Everything is just sort of happening, and remember, it just oozes out. What about this one? So here's the gland here, and the product's going this way is where the product's going. Here's the gland, and the product's going this way. What do you think this one is? It is Holocrine. And it's not Holocrine because that's the only thing that's left. But look, down here we have small cells. Look how small these cells are. That's because they've just divided. In fact, you can even see some that are still in the process of mitosis. Look at this one right here. It hasn't even finished mitosis yet. Same thing over here. And then as you move this way, look what happens to the size of the cells. They get bigger and bigger and bigger until finally, look, they lose their nucleus because they're rupturing and popping, and they go out like that. So yeah, this is Holocrine, and these cells are going to rupture at the top. And we're going to have to make new cells down at the bottom, and that's why there's mitosis going on down here. Okay, any questions about how to pick the different ones out? So we have two ways of classifying glands, and so every gland can be classified both ways. So if we go back to this gland here and we look at the shape of it, what shape does that look like to you? Remember, the three shapes are tubular, acinar, and tubuloacinar. What shape does it look like? What shape does it look like? So if we pick this one, remember it's holocrine, but it's also acinar. We can classify it both ways. Does that make sense to everyone? This one is a cross section, but this is tubular. So this is tubular and merocrine. If we could see this one over here better, we would see the tube. But all glands can be classified both ways. So let's talk about some glands that we have in the body. So the glands that we're going to talk about are sweat glands and oil glands, and then some modified glands of these. So let's look at sweat glands first. So sweat glands make basically sweat. And sweat, if you think about what it is, it's actually mostly water. But it's not just water. Have you ever tasted sweat? What does it taste like? It's salty, that's right, because there's sodium and chloride in it. It also has some waste products in it and other things. Even some vitamins, like vitamin C, is found in sweat. But anyway, it's mostly water. And remember, the whole point of this is to cool us off. Well, if you look at humans, we actually have two types of sweat glands, two types. And their names tell you a lot about them. We just learned about how the glands secrete. And so we have two types of sweat glands. One type secretes by the apocrine method, and so that's what it's called. Remember what apocrine means? Apo means apex. So what this is going to do is it's going to mean the tops of cells are going to pinch off. And so not only in that sweat are we going to have salt and water, we're also going to have tops of cells in it. But look at this one, Merocrine. Merocrine, remember, means no damage or whatever, where all we're going to see in this is sweat. There's not going to be any cell pieces at all. And so we're going to wind up with two different types of sweat, just like we have two different types of sweat glands. So let's look at these. When we look at it on the model, this is what they look like. They are tubular glands. So it's a tube. Well, but it's not a tube like this, the way we expect it. What it is that, and then the bottom part is all balled up. So they look like this. They look like a ball on a string. They're called coiled tubular glands, but they're still tubular. And we have two types. We have Merocrine. So they're coiled tubular and Merocrine. And we have Apocrine. They're coiled tubular and Apocrine. Let's look at the difference between these. If we look at it in the skin, this is what they look like. So remember, this is a coiled tubular. It's like a ball on a string. And here's the ball right here. So when you're talking about Merocrine, we have a very tight ball. It's balled very tightly, small, and again, they're Merocrine. But if we look at Apocrine, the ball is much, much, much bigger, much looser ball than this one. And again, they're going to secrete by the Apocrine method. And so we're going to get the tops of cells pinching off. And so we have this large ball that's loose, and then we're going to have the tops of the cells pinch off. There's one other big difference here. Look at this gland. It goes straight to the surface. But this gland is always associated with a hair. So they're very different from each other. Let's look at the Merocrine glands first. So again, Merocrine, that means there's no damage to the cells. And so if we look in the sweat, there's nothing in the sweat that has anything to do with cells. It's just plain old normal sweat. Well, we have these all over our body, everywhere. But they're concentrated on the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, and your face. But you also have them on your arms, and you also have them on your legs, and on your back, and on your abdomen. But they're concentrated in the palms, the soles, and the forehead. And so again, they look like this. Tight little ball. It goes directly to the surface. And so when the sweat comes out, it just goes on to the surface. It wets the surface, and then that evaporates and it cools us off. So Merocrine sweat glands are all about cooling. Here's what they look like again. There's our tight little ball. So if we look in the sweat, we're going to see any cell parts. No cell parts. What we're going to have is water and salt, some vitamins, some waste products, but no cell parts. These glands start functioning the day you are born. They function from birth. So that means if an infant gets hot, it's going to sweat to cool itself off. and they're going to function till the day you die. Again, their purpose is all about thermoregulation, regulating your body temperature. If you look at apocrine ones, though, they're different. Remember, apocrine sweat glands are much looser. It's a bigger ball, and they're always associated with a hair. So in other words, the product comes out and it travels to the surface with the hair, and it coats the hair. Well, we don't find apocrine sweat glands everywhere. Here's what they look like over here. And look, you can see tall cells and short cells, tall cells and short cells. So remember, what's going to be in here is not only the sweat, but also the top, the apex of cells. And so that sweat is going to have cell parts in it. And so when we look at it, I went too far. When we look at it, it has sweat, but it's also got things like the cell membrane, which is fatty, and it's got proteins in it because it has cell parts in it. And those cell parts make great food for bacteria. And so when the bacteria metabolize those cell parts, we get gases, we get odors. So this sweat has an odor to it. It's smelly. But if we go back to that other one, remember, it has no cell parts in it, none. And so there's no food for bacteria. And so this has no smell. This kind of sweat is not smelly. It has no odor to it. Well, here's another difference. Remember, Merocrine sweat glands start functioning at birth, and they're all about thermoregulation. But apocrine sweat glands start functioning when you hit puberty. And remember, they are going to secrete this product which has cell parts in it, and so we're going to have smelly sweat. And then one more difference is, remember, these are all over your body. They're everywhere. Now, they're concentrated in your hands, your feet, and your face, but they're everywhere. These are only localized to certain places. And all those places are hairy, and they become hairy at puberty because that's when these cells, these glands, start working. And so this is things like your armpits and your groin area, the pubic area. And so if you think about armpits, the groin, also around the anus, places like that, those areas have body odor. So body odor is actually produced by bacteria. Any questions? So, Merocrine, Apocrine. Merocrine, Apocrine. Not smelly, no odor, smelly, odor. So, think about this. When children sweat, let's say you're 6 years old, when you sweat, does it have an odor? No. Little children can go out and play all day long, get sweaty and nasty and dirty, and they come in and they have no body odor. But remember, when you hit puberty, these start working. And so if you think about like a 12 or 13-year-old, and they go out and they play, when they come in, nobody wants to be around them because they have a lot of body odor. Any questions? Okay. There's some other types of sweat glands. These are modified sweat glands. So they don't produce sweat, but they come from the same general product. We're only going to look at two of these, but one of them is called ceruminous glands. So ceruminous glands are found here. They're found in the ear canal, and they make earwax. And so earwax has a function. It's a waxy substance, and what it does is it coats the surface of your eardrum and helps repel water. So it keeps water out of your ear. It also, if you ever taste it, has a very, very nasty, bitter taste to it. And it's thought that this nasty, bitter taste helps repel insects. Because if an insect gets in your ear, it's really difficult for it to come back out because there's no way out, it can only go in. So if you think about a roach crawling in your ear, once it gets in there, there's no place for it to go. Roaches don't back up very well, and so it's just stuck in there. So it's much better if you keep them from getting in there to begin with. And then another modified sweat gland is mammary glands. So mammary glands are apocrine glands, just like the kind that develop at puberty. These also develop at puberty, but instead of secreting this smelly sweat, what they secrete is milk. And so they're only found here. So these are those mammary glands. This is not a mammary gland. This is a breast. And the breast is actually mostly fat. The mammary glands, if you're not pregnant or not nursing, are very, very, very tiny. It's only toward the end of pregnancy and when the baby's born that they become big and start working. And males also have mammary glands. Now, males generally don't have breasts, but they do have mammary glands. And so if you give the right hormone to a male can produce milk also, just like a female can. Any questions about either of these? Okay, here's what they look like under a microscope. So these are the mammary glands. These are those milk-producing glands. And then here's the ceruminous gland, these earwax-producing glands. And again, these are only found in very specific places. Another type of gland that we have in the body is called a sebaceous gland. So sebaceous glands produce sort of what we think of as being oil. It is an oily secretion, but it's technically called sebum. So they make sebum. So sebum is this oily secretion. These are holocrine glands. And so remember, holocrine glands are going to swell up, swell up, swell up until they rupture. So if you look what comes out of an oil gland, it's not only oil, it's also a bunch of cell parts. Well, the reason we have oil glands is because it helps to soften our hair and soften our skin. It also helps to repel water. And so when you look at these are all associated with the hair. So here's a hair, and there's an oil gland. There's an oil gland. Here's a hair, and there's an oil gland. There's an oil gland. And so just like we saw before, the product comes out with the hair. It coats the hair, and then it also coats the surface of the skin. And it makes the skin more flexible. It makes it less likely to crack or tear. And it also keeps it from drying out. So it keeps it from flaking as much. Well, when you look at these, here's the shape of this gland. What shape is that? Anybody remember? It's acinar. And if you look at the gland, look, down here the cells are small and they're going through mitosis. But as you get up higher up, they get bigger and bigger and bigger till they pop. So this gland is acinar and it's holocrine. We also have oil glands on the palms of our hands and soles of our feet. Not nearly as many, but we do have them. But remember, there's no hairs there. And so when you're talking about on the palms and places like that, they don't go up with the hair. They just go directly to the surface. But there aren't that many of these. Almost all of them are like this. One of the things that can happen with these glands is when around the time of puberty, they become very, very, very active because they're influenced by hormones. The same hormones that cause you to change at puberty, they also make these glands become very, very, very active. And when they become very active, sometimes what happens is they get clogged up. And when they get clogged up, pressure builds up and you start getting inflammation like crazy. And you get a pustule here. And so you get acne. So if you look at acne, that's what it is. It's a pustule full of this oil. It doesn't have anything to do with how clean you keep your face. It has to do with how active these are. And then another thing that happens is once the sebum gets trapped in here, it can get infected. And if it's infected, then you get this big inflammation. White blood cells come rushing to the area to help try to get rid of the bacteria. And so what they can do is they can damage healthy tissue, and so sometimes you wind up with scarring from it. But if you press it, look what happens. This sebum that was collected in there, plus it includes a bunch of dead cells and keratin and all sorts of things like that, comes out. Sometimes there's no opening to the surface, so you wind up with a cyst. And you have to actually create an opening in order to make it come out. So it has to be lanced. Any questions? So now we're going to go to the other PowerPoint. And we're going to talk about some other epidermal derivatives. So we looked at glands. Let's look at hairs. So let's look at hairs. So here's that model that we're going to see when we do lab. And then there's our Merocrine sweat gland, and here's our apocrine sweat gland, and here's a hair and a hair follicle. So let's talk about this. So first of all, if you think about why we have hair, well, some animals are covered in hair, and they even have like fur. And for them, it's mostly about insulation and protection and all that sort of stuff. But during human evolution, we lost this hair. We lost it. So sometimes humans are called naked apes because we're very closely related to apes, but we have very little hair. But we still have the same number of hairs that we always did. It's just that they're smaller. They're reduced in size. But if you look down at your arms, if you look at a person's face, you still see these tiny, tiny little hairs. They look like peach fuzz. But humans have the same number of hairs as our close relatives, like chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. It's just that they're small hairs. Well, it seems as if they've lost their function, but they haven't. They still are places where we need some sort of protection from physical trauma. And so we have them on the scalp, we have them by the eyelids and places like that. And then not only is there these little tiny hairs, but every little tiny hair has a nerve attached to it. And so if something goes crawling across your skin like a bug or something, when it hits that hair, the hair vibrates and it sends a signal to your brain so that you know it's there. And so hairs can alert our body to the presence of things like insects. It can guard areas that need protection from physical trauma. So Priscilla says, for the lecture exam, we have questions about those. What do you mean by those, Priscilla? Are you talking about glands or are you talking about hairs? Well, the short answer is you'll have questions about both. Anything that we cover in lecture is fair game for an exam or a quiz. Okay, well, let's continue talking about hair. So basically we have hairs everywhere, except we don't have hairs at all in some places. So there are no hairs on your palms, or no hairs on your soles of your feet, there are no hairs on the lips, also in places like the nipples and the external genitalia. But except for these places, we have hair. So what is hair? Well, if you look at the top part of the skin, remember the top part of the skin is the epidermis. And remember the epidermis, we start out with living cells, these keratinocytes, and as they move up, they produce keratin, and eventually we wind up with this dead layer of cells that covers our skin. Well, hairs are exactly the same thing. They're these dead cells full of keratin, just like at the stratum corneum. Now, the keratin is a little different. The keratin on our skin is called soft keratin, and the keratin on our hairs is called hard keratin. And just like before, when we saw the skin had color in it, the hair has color in it. Same thing, we have these melanins. Remember, there's 3 different types of melanin. And so we can get several different colors of hair. One thing that's different, though, is from almost all people, at some point, we stop producing melanin in the hair. We don't do that in the skin, but we do it in the hair. And as soon as that happens, the hair loses its color. And so it goes gray or white or fades. It loses color. Well, here's what a hair looks like. It's got layers to it. In the center of the hair is called the medulla. In the center is there's very few cells. Sometimes there's actually air in here. Gray hair has air in the middle. And then there's a layer around that called the cortex. And the cortex has lots of cells. It's dense. And this is where the color is. And this is where the shape, the texture, and all of that is. And then there's a very thin layer on the outside. This little bitty layer right here. And this is called the cuticle. And so the cuticle, when you look at it, it's almost like shingles. It's cells that overlap each other. And so it sheds water. Looks a little bit like scales on a fish. So here is a picture of the hair. So this is the hair right here. So there's our medulla. Again, look, few cells, sparse. It could even be air. There's the cortex, and that's where we're going to see the color of the hair. And its cells are much, much denser. There are lots of cells here. And then this little thin area right here is the cuticle. And again, it's like shingles. Now, this part is not a hair. That is the hair follicle. And that's what produces the hair. And so we'll talk about the follicle in just a second. Any questions, though, about the hair itself? Can everybody see the three layers? Okay, well, let's look at this hair follicle. So if you look at the skin, when you get the epidermis, the skin folds in like this. And this folded in area that we see right here is the follicle. It produces the hair. So the follicle builds the hair. That's why it's called an epidermal derivative, because this is epidermis, and so is this. This is epidermis. It's just folded in. Well, when we look at the follicle, it looks like this. And you can see two different layers in here as well. There's one layer here and one layer here. So we have what's called an external epithelial root sheath and an internal epithelial root sheath. And then there's an extra layer around the outside, and that is made out of connective tissue. So when we look at this, we can see a bunch of layers. If we start from the outside and work our way in, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, and then remember we have 3 layers in the hair itself. So there's actually 6 layers. And the easiest way to learn these is just to learn them in order. And here's how it goes. From the outside in, there's a connective tissue sheath right there. In this picture, it's blue. So that's connective tissue. And this is what anchors the hair. It holds it in place. So if you pull on a hair, it doesn't easily come out because it's anchored in there. Well, this is connective tissue. And then this over here is epithelial tissue. Well, remember, all epithelial tissues have a basement membrane. And that's what this is right here. It's not called a basement membrane. It's called the glassy membrane. So we have the connective tissue sheath. That's this right here. And then we have the glassy membrane. That's that right there. And then we have 2 layers of epithelial tissue. This one and this one. So we have an external epithelial root sheath and an internal epithelial root sheath. And then our hair itself. So if we look at it here, you can see the same thing. There's the connective tissue sheath, there's the glassy membrane, external, internal, and then the hair. There's the connective tissue sheath, there's the glassy membrane, external, internal, and then the hair. Now this is a slide and it's a little bit harder to see, but you can still see it. Here's a much better picture. Look, there's the connective tissue sheath, right? There's the basement membrane or the glassy membrane. External, internal, cuticle, cortex, medulla. Any questions? Again, the easiest way to learn it is just do it in order. Connective tissue sheath, glassy membrane, external epithelial root sheath, internal epithelial root sheath, and then the cuticle, cortex, and medulla. Connective tissue sheath, glassy membrane, external epithelial sheath, internal, cuticle, cortex, and medulla. And you should be able to label these. Here's a real slide, and you can see it's labeled on here for you. So that's what the hair looks like in cross section. We'll look at it in long section. It looks like this or like this. It's exactly the same. There's the connective tissue sheath. There's the glassy membrane, external, internal. There's the cuticle, cortex, and medulla. Well, if you follow the hair down to the bottom, it swells out down at the bottom, and we get what's called a hair bulb. The hair bulb is where the hair is growing from. And if you look in the center of the hair bulb, you see something that looks like a nipple. Remember, the word for nipple is papilla. So there's a hair papilla down here, and blood vessels are in this papilla. And the blood vessels are going to nourish the hair, and that's where the hair is going to grow from. We can also see melanocytes down here. So just like we saw with the skin, the melanocytes are going to make melanin, it's going to get released, and these cells are going to absorb it. And so these cells are going to change color. And so if you have dark hair, they're going to be dark. If you have blonde hair, they're going to be very, very sparse. If we blow that up, it looks like this. So again, there's the connective tissue sheath. There's the glassy membrane. There's our external. There's our internal. Here's the cuticle. Here's the cortex. And here's the medulla. And then this whole thing is the bulb. And there's our papilla. Here's our melanocytes. And that's what we see when we look at it under a microscope. Any questions? Let's see if you can figure out what these are. So, tell me what you think these are. So A, B, and so on. Everybody figure it out for yourself, and then I'll ask you one or two. So what do you think B is? It's this thing right here. What is B? It's the glassy membrane. What is E? E is this part right here. Oh, Johanna, this is the bulb, remembers, at the bottom. This is a cross section. This is the cuticle. So what does that mean G is? What does the G mean? It's the medulla, exactly. So you can come back to this slide and practice on it because each of these are labeled. And you'll probably get something like this on a quiz or on a lecture test. And so you'll need to be able to identify what each of these things are. There's one more thing associated with hairs. If you look at every single hair, there's a little muscle attached to every single hair. It's called the erector pili. It's smooth muscle, so if you remember from when we talked about histology, it's involuntary. And what happens is when you get cold or if you get afraid, what's going to happen is this little muscle is going to contract. And when the muscle contracts, what's going to happen is this is going to get shorter. This hair is going to, it was like this, it's going to get pulled straight up. Not drawing it very well, but anyway, it's going to get pulled straight up. So your hair stands up. It stands on end. And so what it's supposed to do is to, keep you warmer. That doesn't work very well in humans because we have such limited size hair. But it also, if you're another kind of animal, it makes you look bigger. So if you think about a dog, when it approaches another dog, so you have a dog and their hair on the back of their neck stands up like this until they know whether or not it's a threat or whatever. So they look bigger. Also, if they get bitten here, it's much more likely that they're just this animal that bites them is going to get a mouthful of hair instead of actual tissue. Well, we have this exact same thing going on with us. It's just not very effective anymore. And then one other thing that all hairs have is they have a little nerve ending down here. And so if you bump the hair, it vibrates. And when it vibrates, it activates this nerve. And so again, they can act like receptors, and so they can alert you that something's touching your skin or there's a bug crawling on you or something like that. So we have this nerve ending, and then we also have this erector pili. There's the nerve ending right there, and there's the erector pili right there. Any questions? Well, not only do we have hair, we have different types of hair. So we have this hair which is called vellus hair. Vellus hair, the easiest way you can think of it's like peach fuzz. It's fine hair, fine body hair. So if you picture like a child and looking at their face, or if you look at a female and look at their face, there's this fine hair there. But we also have much coarser, longer, stronger hair, and that's called terminal hair. And so that's found on the scalp, it's found in the eyebrows, it's found in the pubic area and the armpits and places like that. And if you're a male, it's found in the beard and the chest. That's terminal hair. Well, look, they look very different. Vellus hair is very thin, it's tiny, but another thing that's different about it is it's very close to the surface. And look, there's no papilla. No papilla. And so this hair grows much, much slower than the other hair. And if you look at terminal hair, look, it's much thicker and coarser, and it's deeper. So it's anchored more strongly, and it does have a papilla. And remember, that area is where the blood vessels are, and that's where it grows from. And so this grows faster and longer. So when we look at a hair, we can actually tell by looking at the cross section whether or not this hair is going to be curly or wavy, or if it's going to be straight. We can look at the cross section. So look at these. So not only the hair itself, but also the follicle. So look, this is round. It has a round hair, round cross section, and round follicle. If it's like that, it's a straight hair. And if you look at it, wavy hair, look, it's oval shaped. The hair is oval shaped, and so is the follicle, oval shaped. And then if you look at curly hair, look, it's ribbon-like. It's very, very flat, and it has a flat follicle too. Well, looking at these, you probably can get an idea of which one of these is the strongest. Which of these types of hair do you think is the strongest? Want to guess? So Joseph says curly. Curly's actually the weakest kind of hair. Think about ropes. You're going to hang yourself or hang something with a rope. Would you use this one, or would you use this one, or would you use something that's ribbon shaped? This one is the one that's the strongest. And because it's the strongest, you can grow it the longest. So people who have straight hair can grow it very, very, very long, and it doesn't break. It doesn't fray at the end. It doesn't split. It doesn't do that. And so it gets longer and longer and longer. But people who have very curly hair, what happens is as it gets to the end, it begins to fray. It begins to split. And it breaks. So the hair can't get very long before this happens. And so if you think about different ethnicities, if you think about people who have really, really long straight hair, and these are places like maybe in India or Japan or places like that, their hair gets really, really, really long. But if you think about people who have very, very, very curly hair, places like Africa and places like that, their hair does not get very long before it breaks. Margarita says Native Americans. Yes, Native Americans are over here. They have really long hair. Does it make sense to everyone? So look at this one. What do you think this person's hair is? Is it curly, or is it wavy, or is it straight? This person has straight hair. That's right. And you can see the color of this person's hair. There's the color right there. So this person probably doesn't have black hair, but they have some sort of dark colored hair, like brown or something. Make sense to everyone? Can everybody pick out these layers? There's a layer. There's a layer. There's one. There's one. There's one, there's one, there's one. Everybody can pick out all the layers. Any questions? Okay. Well, while we're talking about hair, let's talk about how it grows. So there are phases to hair growth. So hair grows for a while, but then it regresses, it shrinks a little bit, and then it rests for a while. So there's these three phases. So there's growth, and then there's this little shrinking or regressive stage, which doesn't last very long, but There's that, because the follicle is shrinking. And then there's this resting stage where really nothing happens. And then what's going to happen, either growth is going to start over again, or what's going to happen is you're going to shed the hair. And so some hairs then have a long growth period, but some hairs have a very short growth period. So if you have a long growth period, it can be like years, like 10 years. And hair can grow about a half an inch per month. So if you're talking about 10 years of growth, 10 years, that's 120 months. And it grows about a half an inch per month. That's like 60 inches. So this person could have a hair that's 5 feet long. But there are other places on the body where the growth period is very, very short. So if you look at things like the eyebrows and eyelashes, they have a really short growth period. So they still grow about a half an inch per month. But if you only have 1 to 2 or 3 months, then you're not going to be very, very long. Another thing that can happen to hair is it is lost. So hair is lost constantly. But what usually happens is we replace the hair at the same rate at which it's lost. And so we keep the hair we have. But when you hit about age 40, what happens is you begin to lose hair faster than you replace it. And so what happens, the hair begins to thin out. So you lose hair faster. And so it's just normal. Both sexes, their hair begins to thin after about age 40. And hair loss is just called alopecia. And it doesn't tell you why the hair is being lost. It could be due to age. It could be due to a medicine you're taking. It could be due to, I don't know, all kinds of things. Sickness, illness, all sorts of things. But alopecia is not baldness. Stress, yes. Alopecia is not baldness. That's something completely different. So let's talk about baldness. So baldness is actually genetically determined. It's your DNA. You can inherit it from your parents. Well, remember, we have 2 chromosomes. We have pairs of chromosomes. And so there's a baldness gene that is on this here. You either have it or you don't have it. So you can have it on one or you can have it on both your chromosomes. Even if you have the gene, though, you don't necessarily go bald, because you also have to have something else. You have to have the gene, but you also have to have a hormone. The hormone is called DHT. DHT stands for dihydrotestosterone. So essentially, this is mostly a male hormone. So think about this. If you are a male, you already have DHT. So we have DHT. And so if you have this hormone and you have the gene, they're going to interact and you're going to go bald. So males tend to go bald fairly often, but females, most females don't have much of this hormone. And so females, even if they do have the gene, they don't go bald because they don't have that hormone. But if you take a female who has the gene and you supply the hormone, so you inject it or you give it to them some way, what's going to happen is now they're going to go bald. So for a male, it's much easier to go bald than it is for a female because males already have this hormone. All they need is the gene. Females, though, on the other hand, don't have the hormone, so it doesn't matter whether they have the gene or not. So when you look at it, here's what happens. The follicle begins to change. So here's a normal follicle. But when you have that DHT and the hormone and the gene, what happens is the follicle shrinks. And so as the follicle shrinks, we wind up with a very small follicle. And that hair, which was a terminal hair, becomes a vellus hair. And so this is what it looks like. So here, terminal hair. But look right there, the hair's changing. It's becoming this vellus hair. So if you pick someone who's perfectly bald like this and you look at their scalp, they still have tiny, tiny, tiny hairs. But they're vellus hairs. They're not terminal hairs anymore. And it's called male pattern baldness because it happens in stages. Make sense? That's what it looks like in males. But look, some females have a lot of DHT, more than normal females do. And if they have that gene, look what happens to them. They also go bald. So females can go bald too, but they generally don't go as bald as males do. Any questions? Okay, well, that's the integument. So what we're going to start doing with every organ system is not only talk about the normal organ system, but we're also going to talk about some things that can go wrong with it. So one of the worst things that can go wrong with skin, with the integument, is burns. So let's talk about burns a little bit. So most of us associate burns with heat, but heat is not the only thing that can produce a burn. You can have an electrical burn, a radiation burn, a chemical burn, but whatever it is, what's going to happen is the tissue is going to damage, the cells are going to die, denature proteins. And so all of these cells on the surface are going to be damaged, either a little bit or a lot. And the damage can be deeper or deeper or deeper. And so when it penetrates different layers of the skin, we're going to see different symptoms and different problems. Well, when you have a burn, basically if you're removing the skin, it's almost as if you took a knife and peeled the skin off, just peeled it off. What you're going to leave is this tissue underneath that's unprotected. So this unprotected tissue is going to be subject to all sorts of things. One of the things it's going to be subject to is infection. But infection takes a while. It takes days. But what will happen even faster than infection is the fluid comes to your skin. Remember, in normal skin, we have this keratin here, and it can't get out. But if you take the keratin off, the water, the fluid just zooms out of your body. And so what you wind up with is dehydration like crazy. So the most immediate threat, the most immediate thing that's going to kill you is dehydration. That also causes things like electrolyte imbalances, and you wind up with things like shock, your blood pressure drops like crazy, your kidneys shut down, and then you wind up dying from all of the toxins and the loss of blood pressure. So if you want to save this person who has an extensive burn, you're going to have to replace the fluids, because the fluids are just going to come out no matter what. And if you don't replace those fluids, again, we're going to lose blood pressure, we're going to lose kidney function, and so on. But if you can replace the fluids, you can prevent this from happening. But you have to know how much fluid you need to replace. And so what we use to determine this is something called the rule of nines. So the rule of nines is literally just a way to estimate fluid loss. Well, the way it works is that our body proportions are basically 9%. Everything is 9% or some part of 9%. The front of each leg is 9%. The back of each leg is 9%. The front of your chest is 9%. The back of your chest is 9%. The front of the abdomen, 9%, 9%. The front of an arm is half of 9%. And the back of an arm is half of 9%. Everything's based on this 9%. Even your head is based on 9%. So if I come to an emergency room and this much of my body is burned, this much right here, I can say 4.5% of this person's body. I can weigh this person pretty easily, get a weight, 4.5%, and I can look up on a table how much fluid that person needs to get. So very quickly, without doing anything else except looking up on a table, I know how much fluid to provide to this person. And then burns can be scattered. So you could be on the back of the neck and in the back of the arm like this, and then here. So you have to be able to add these things up. But look, this is probably 4.5%. This might be 2.5%. And here it is, another 4.5%. So if I add those together, I get about 11.5 or 12%. And again, I can look that up on the table and figure it out. So that's what the rule of nines is. Any questions about the rule of nines? What happens if you give too much? Well, when you overhydrate someone, what happens is their tissues swell. So everything swells, including your brain. And when your brain swells, it's got no place to go. And so you can increase the pressure in the brain and cause things like crushing the brain. You also increase the blood volume too much. And if you increase the blood volume, you increase the blood pressure. And when your blood pressure is too high, you get things like heart attacks and strokes. Also, all of these tissues are going to swell also, whether they're normal or not normal. They're going to swell up. So you don't want to overhydrate. It's just as bad as if you underhydrate. And so knowing this ability or having this ability to estimate it is really, really important. It works for children too. But with children, their body proportions are different than they are in an adult, and so it's not nearly as accurate. But children, they have big heads. Their heads are a much bigger proportion of their body, and so you have to take all that into account. But there's an adapted version for children as well. But again, it's not quite as accurate. So let's look at the different types of burns. There are 3 types. There's first degree, second degree, and third degree burns. So a first degree burn is the least serious. And that's because the only thing involved is the epidermis. And so remember, we've got these layers here. And so it's just the upper layer right here that's damaged. And what's going to happen is that's going to slough off. It's going to peel off. But we have the cells here that can replace the part that comes off. And so this is very painful. It hurts like crazy, but it doesn't leave any permanent damage. There's no scarring or anything like that. It swells up, it turns red, it hurts, but it's temporary and there's no scarring. So if you look at this person, they burn their hand. Well, like I said, different parts have different types of burns. So this part is not what we're talking about. We're talking about this here, here, here. So if we blow that up, you can see it's swollen, it's red. And again, the top layer of the skin is going to come off, but the underlying tissues will replace that without any kind of scarring. Let's look at a second-degree burn. So a second-degree burn goes all the way through the epidermis down into the papillary layer of the dermis. And so this entire epidermis is going to come off, but so is this papillary layer. And what happens here is when we destroy this epidermis, remember there's a basement membrane. And that basement membrane is like glue that holds everything down. So here's the cells up here. It's glued down. And then there's this layer up here that has keratin in it, which is a little bit waterproof. Well, a second-degree burn destroys this basement membrane. And so the glue doesn't hold down anymore. And so fluid pushes this up, but it can't get out because of the keratin. And so what's going to happen is it's going to bubble up like that. And so you get blisters. So if you look at a second-degree burn, it has blisters. And again, this is just body fluid. This is fluid from inside the body, pushing it up because the basement membrane is no longer holding it down. It's no longer a layer of glue. And so it's going to fill up this space with fluid. But second-degree burns also heal without scarring. So again, there's no scarring. And again, they hurt like crazy. They hurt, it swells, all of that, but there's no scarring. Is it more painful? Probably yes, I would say it is. I don't know exactly though. And then we have third-degree burns. So a third-degree burn is sometimes called a full-thickness burn, which means that the epidermis is destroyed, the dermis is destroyed, and the hypodermis, all of that is destroyed. All the way down, and below that we're going to have things like muscle and connective tissue. So this entire skin basically is destroyed. And an easy way to think about this or to imagine it is it's just been cooked. It's just like you cooked meat on a grill. It's cooked. And so it changes color, it changes texture, it changes everything, just like what happens when you cook meat. Well, remember there's a whole bunch of nerve endings running through here, but all of those nerve endings are also cooked. They're destroyed. And so initially, this is not painful. It's not painful in the beginning. Also, there's no swelling in the beginning because it's cooked meat. And so this meat, this tissue is dead. It's never going to heal. It's never going to be able to replace itself. And so unless you just want to expose all of the tissue underneath it, you're going to have to replace this somehow. And so we do that with skin grafts. And you tend to get very major scarring that happens here. In fact, the person may never look like they did before. But when you look at it, this is what it looks like. Look at it. It looks like meat that's been cooked. Well, again, this is dead. It's completely dead tissue. So before we can do any kind of treatment or anything, this has to be removed. It has to be debrided. Now, the way they do that today is they put you under. They give you a general anesthetic and they knock you out. But it wasn't always like that. Before anesthetics came into play, they didn't knock the people out. They just took a brush and they just scraped it off while you were awake. So they put you in a bathtub and use a stiff brush and just scrape all this away. And so you would hear people just screaming at the top of their lungs until they passed out from the pain if you went to a burn ward. Fortunately, we don't do it that way anymore, but it still has to be debrided. And so we knock the person out and then we take the tissue off. That has to be done before a skin graft can be done. And so what a skin graft is we take healthy skin, and it can be taken from another place on your body, like maybe your leg or someplace like that. And they use this machine that looks almost like a cheese grater. It's got a knife in it. And the knife only cuts a certain depth, and so it peels away. And then the skin is put through a machine that creates a mesh. And that mesh makes it cover a larger wound, so it looks like this. And then the cells grow in these spaces in between. They grow horizontally. But still, you're going to wind up with a big, big scar. Recently, though, a new way of doing this has happened. Instead of doing it this way and creating a mesh, they actually grow human tissue in vitro. So they take some of your cells and they put it in tissue culture. And they grow this skin. This is your skin. It just was grown outside of your body. But because it's your skin, there's no chance of rejection. So you don't have to worry about your immune system destroying this. Also, it's not a mesh. And because it's not a mesh, there's less scarring. And so if you look at that, it looks like this. Oops. It looks like this. And so you only get a little bit of scarring around the edges. Another thing that's bad that can go wrong with skin, we mentioned it already, is skin cancer. But there's 3 different types of skin cancer, at least major types. There's what's called basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell, and then melanoma. So let's look at these real quick. Here's what they look like. They look different from each other. So basal cells look shiny. They look shiny. They're usually raised. Some people mistake them for a mole. But if you look at squamous cells, they look scaly. And they're often found on edges, like the edge of your hairline or on your lip. And then melanomas look like this. So when you go to talk about them, basal cells come from the stratum basal. They're very slow growing, they don't metastasize, and so you can just surgically remove them. And so they come in and they just cut out this chunk, and then they sew these edges together. And usually there's no reoccurrence. Squamous cells, though, do metastasize, but it's slow. Again, they happen usually on edges, and they're scaly and they bleed. So if you bump them, they bleed. Well, they come in and take this out, but they also, remember, it's spreading, and they don't know exactly where it's spreading, so usually there's radiation of the area around it. And so you're going to wind up with a fairly large scar. Melanomas come from melanocytes. Melanocytes, remember, make melanin, and so these are often, mostly always, colored. Melanocytes are very active cells, and so this is a very active cancer. It metastasizes very, very quickly, and it's also very hard to treat. So when you look at it, they look like this. And then here's what you see on the surface, but here's where the metastasis is happening. And it enters the bloodstream, it enters the other fluids of the body, and it travels to places like your bones and to your lungs. And then you get new cancers in those places. Oops. And so here, there's not much metastasis. But by the time you get to here, it's really too late for just surgery. And so you have to do chemo. That way it goes all over the body. We have this ABCDE rule for skin cancer, for melanoma, and these are the characteristics. Look, this is benign here. So it's not this cancer. And look, it's round, it's symmetrical, but this one's like shaped this. So A stands for asymmetrical. Here the borders are smooth. Here the borders are indented. So the borders. And then here the color is generally just one color, but here it's usually more than one color. And then D stands for diameter. So we use a sort of a pencil eraser as sort of a visual. If you think about the size of most pencil erasers, that's about 1/4 inch in diameter. And so this is smaller than a pencil eraser, larger. And then E stands for evolving. So you're probably born with a mole, or you have one since you were a little bitty kid and they never change. But if they do start changing, then they're probably not a mole. Anybody have any questions? So that's where we're going to stop for today. We finished up the integument. And so next time we'll move on and we'll be talking about the bone tissue. If you come back this afternoon, we'll be doing the lab for the integument.